CMIS 3224. Web Designing and E-Commerce. CSS Part 3. Position property. The position property specifies the type of positioning method used for an element. There are 5 different position values: static, relative, fixed, absolute, sticky. Elements are then positioned using the top, bottom, left, and right properties. However, these properties will not work unless the position property is set first. They also work differently depending on the position value. Position, static. HTML elements are positioned static by default. Static positioned elements are not affected by the top, bottom, left, and right properties. An element with position, static, is not positioned in any special way. It is always positioned according to the normal flow of the page. This div element has position, static. Here is the CSS that is used. We have some text in the div. Class static. Position static. Position, relative. An element with position, relative, is positioned relative to its normal position. Setting the top, right, bottom, and left properties of a relatively positioned element will cause it to be adjusted away from its normal position. Other content will not be adjusted to fit into any gap left by the element. This div element has position, relative. Here is the CSS that is used. Class relative. Position relative. Position, fixed. An element with position, fixed, is positioned relative to the viewport, which means it always stays in the same place, even if the page is scrolled. The top, right, bottom, and left properties are used to position the element. A fixed element does not leave a gap in the page where it would normally have been located. Notice the fixed element in the lower right corner of the page. Here is the CSS that is used. Class fixed. Position refixed. Position, absolute. An element with position, absolute, is positioned relative to the nearest positioned ancestor, instead of positioned relative to the viewport, like fixed. However, if an absolute positioned element has no positioned ancestors, it uses the document body and moves along with page scrolling. Note, a positioned element is one whose position is anything except static. Two divs. Division 1 class relative. Division 2 class absolute. Absolute position doesn't change. Change some values. Position, sticky. An element with position, sticky, is position based on the user's scroll position. A sticky element toggles between relative and fixed, depending on the scroll position. It is positioned relative until a given offset position is met in the viewport, then it sticks in place, like position fixed. Note: Internet Explorer does not support sticky positioning. Safari requires a WebKit prefix, see example below. You must also specify at least one of top, right, bottom or left for sticky positioning to work. We have two divs. Add padding bottom. Now we have a scroll. Class sticky. Overlapping elements. When elements are positioned, they can overlap other elements. The z-index property specifies the stack order of an element, which element should be placed in front of or behind the others. An element can have a positive or negative stack order. An element with greater stack order is always in front of an element with a lower stack order. We have an image and a paragraph. Position absolute. -1 go backward. Positioning text in an image. We have an image. Reduce image size. Add texts. Float and clear. The CSS float property specifies how an element should float. The CSS clear property specifies what elements can float beside the cleared element and on which side. The float property. The float property is used for positioning and formatting content, e.g. let an image float left to the text in a container. The float property can have one of the following values: left, the element floats to the left of its container. Right, the element floats to the right of its container. None, the element does not float, will be displayed just where it occurs in the text. This is default. Inherit, the element inherits the float value of its parent. In its simplest use, the float property can be used to wrap text around images. Float right. We have two paragraphs. In the second paragraph have an image. Float right. Float left. No float. The clear property. The clear property specifies what elements can float beside the cleared element and on which side. The clear property can have one of the following values: none, allows floating elements on both sides. This is default. Left, no floating elements allowed on the left side. Right, no floating elements allowed on the right side. Both, no floating elements allowed on either the left or the right side. Inherit, the element inherits the clear value of its parent. The most common way to use the clear property is after you have used a float property on an element. When clearing floats, you should match the clear to the float. If an element is floated to the left, then you should clear to the left. Your floated element will continue to float, but the cleared element will appear below it on the web page. The following example clears the float to the left. Means that no floating elements are allowed on the left side of the div. We have 4 divs. Same style in div 1 and 3. The clear fix hack. If an element is taller than the element containing it and it is floated, it will overflow outside of its container. Then we can add overflow auto to the containing element to fix this problem. The overflow auto clear fix works well as long as you are able to keep control of your margins and padding, else you might see scroll burrs. The new modern clear fix hack, however, is safer to use, and the following code is used for most web pages. We have 2 divs which include image. Give a break. Float examples. Grid of boxes equal width boxes. We have 3 subdivs. Equal height boxes. In the previous example, you learned how to float boxes side by side with an equal width. However, it is not easy to create floating boxes with equal heights. A quick fix, however, is to set a fixed height, like in the example below. However, this is not very flexible. It is okay if you can guarantee that the boxes will always have the same amount of content in them. But many times, the content is not the same. If you try the example above on a mobile phone, you will see that the second box's content will be displayed outside of the box. This is where CSS3 Flexbox comes in handy, as it can automatically stretch boxes to be as long as the longest box. We set height for the box. When box size decreasing, texts not fit in the box. With the screen's size, it's adjust the box height. See you in the next video.